My personal goal is to make this world and the roots of what we're dealing with now feel so present and so palpable that we can see those connections as a means to begin some kind of a healing. Because I mean, when you go to the doctor, the doctor doesn't just start with like what's ailing you right this moment. They want to know how you got your injury, where are you coming from? I mean, history is always important. And so to bring that past into present, I think is critical for being able to move forward. I mean, it's how we overcome our national trauma.
Good evening, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening with you, Ilyon, to discuss your new book. I read through it, and it was deeply profound. And as it was introduced, it is really narrative nonfiction at its best. But before we get into your book tonight, tonight's event is in honor of your new book, Master, Slave, Husband, Wife. A remarkable story of self-emancipation, which at its time was widely circulated, but largely lost in public memory in recent years. Before we talk about the specifics of your book, I want to start with your journey to finding the craft story, right? For our audience, can you discuss how you rediscovered the crafts in their thrilling narrative of escape?
Yes. Thank you. I just first want to say it's amazing to be here. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Audrey. Thank you for being my conversationalist here, Christian. I'm thrilled to be in this amazing bookstore. I mean, we are surrounded by all these incredible stories. This is really one of my favorite bookstores around. I could just go on and on. And I've loved books all my life, and my connection with the crafts began with their book, because not only did they go on this incredible journey of mutual self-emancipation, but they were storytellers, I mean, they told their story on the road, they wrote their story down, and they passed it on in such a way that we can remember and honor it today. So that for me began when I was in graduate school, and thank goodness, I thank my stars that their narrative, Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom, which was published in 1860, it came across my path thanks to Robert O'Meally at Columbia, who assigned it as required reading. And when I read this, we're all readers, we're all in this bookstore, we all love books. You have that moment when you're just inside of a book and a whole nother world opens up. And that for me was the experience of reading Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom. So they invite us into their world with this incredible story of this really unbelievable journey that they make across 1,000 miles. They are in the center of Georgia, and they are traveling 1,000 miles. They are not going on any kind of underground railroad, which does not go down that far south. They are not, running through woods and things like that. The kind of images that we are often given popularly of what it means to be a fugitive slave, those do not apply here, because they are going over ground, out in the open, with fair-skinned Ellen passing as a wealthy, white, disabled man, and her husband, William, pretending to be her slave. So this is an incredible high-wire performance. And I just dropped into that story, and I wanted to know more, because as much as they told, there was a lot that they could not or would not tell. And that's sort of where my journey began.
That's fantastic. And so I think this lends itself to its next question, because we get their narrative, which you discovered during your graduate study. But one of my questions is, your book is very rich and deeply textured in its detail and its narrative. So how did you begin to fill in those missing pages of those narratives that they either omitted on purpose, or were just not written into their narrative that they produced?
Well, I guess I just started digging a crazy squirrel or something. I mean, that's really what archival research is all about, right? You start looking at what other people, the little nuts and traces that others before you have done before. And thank goodness for me, there were generations of scholars who have been looking at this, because as much as you noted, this story has not been remembered in our public national memory, it has been preserved and cherished and remembered. And people have been studying the story over the generations. So there were little bits. So when I guess I'll start with one line, which is like the family line. This is something that really intrigued me, because Ellen Craft's story is kind of a mystery. The Crafts open their own narrative talking about how they wanted to escape slavery because they did not want to ever be in a position where their enslaver could reach into the cradle that they had built for their child and take their baby away from them. And soon after that, the story is told in William's voice, and what he says is, my wife's first master was her father, and her mother his slave, and the latter is still the slave of his widow. So that's a very packed sentence, and they don't give us much more than that about her family. We know that she missed and loved her mother. We know that she was separated from her mother when she was 11 years old. But we don't get names, and we don't get much detail. There were scholars before, who managed to find the names of the enslavers, James Smith and Eliza Smith. And when you have those names, that becomes sort of like a small point at which you can start going inside. Because people like the Smiths left huge records. When they were losing money, when they were bargaining, buying and selling people, they left records. And it's through those records that I began to start trying to see Ellen and her family members and other people in her world.
And so for our audience, right, we're working with records of wealthy enslavers. And so how are you able to work with the narratives they're producing, right? Because they'd be necessarily biased in a particular way.
Yep.
So how do you work with these documents that are framing this history in a particular way in defense of slavery, right, to tell the story of escape and freedom?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's really the central conundrum that we have, which is that there is such a deep archival imbalance. And this is something that scholars have also written about, because enslaved people like the Crafts were purposely denied literacy. I mean, it's amazing to be in this bookstore that's filled with shelves of all these, incredible stories, and the Crafts were denied the ability to read and write. I mean, that's something that we could speak about in so many different levels. But enslaved people did not leave the kind of records behind. They didn't have those opportunities. So much of what we have in the archives is written by the enslavers. And that's an inherent problem. So it kind of has to be a starting point. We can also open up what we consider the archive. This is something that Taya Miles, a Harvard professor, has written a lot about, like, relying on oral histories, material culture, expanding the definition of what an archive is. But also, I think, has to do with sort of opening up those sources in different ways. And I'll give an example here, which is the story of, in order to find the story of Ellen Craft and her mother and her separation from her mother at age 11, I had to the starting point for that was to look again at the enslaver stories. And in the story that the Crafts write, they talk about how Ellen Craft's biological father's wife, was so angered by the sight of Ellen and her physical resemblance to her biological father that she was the one who took Ellen and gave her away as a wedding gift to her own biological daughter. So Ellen's half-sister received Ellen Craft as a wedding gift when Ellen was 11 years old. And so there's this forcible separation between mother and child. So I went and looked at the records that this woman, Eliza Smith, left behind. And it's kind of an irony that it's through the records of this woman who so hated Ellen Craft and who separated her from her mother that we get the contours of the story and that we get glimpses of Ellen and her mother. One thing that I really struggled with a lot, though, and actually I have to honor my friend Kim Ragusa here, who was an early reader of this draft, is that of one of the first drafts of my book, is one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to recreate the fullness of this world as much as possible and the people within this world, and to be able to summon the life of the enslaved people first, but also the people who enslaved, to understand more where are they coming from, how is it that they made the choices that they did. So I actually found a huge amount of information about Eliza Smith, Ellen Craft's enslaver. I found out sort of her personal pain, her situation, her likes and dislikes, her personality. All kinds of things are revealed in the archives. There isn't the equivalent information about Maria. And when I wrote in an early draft, I attempted to create the fullness of both of their lives, but obviously there was an imbalance going on. And when Kim read this, she pointed this out. She said, I know you don't have the records for Maria. You have the records of Eliza, Mr. Smith. You want to create the fullness of the world, but how do you do that without replicating that very imbalance that we're starting off with in the archives? And that became a huge question for me to grapple with. Like, how do I summon that world and not recreate that imbalance? And what I ended up doing is trying to do that through the writing and through the storytelling. So I might not be able to, we know Mr. Smith, like what were her favorite psalms. We know, when she had her religious awakening. We know the children that she lost when they were babies. We don't have all that information for Maria. But in recounting some of that information, I can go back on the level of the sentence, on the level of the paragraph, on the level of the page, and see, how am I framing this story? Who gets to own each of these parts of the story? Who's going to be the subject in each sentence? Who's going to be the direct object? Who's going to have the agency within the very grammar of the story that I'm trying to tell? And that's where we can begin to shift the balance.
And I like this sort of look towards, the writing, and doing these sort of close reads and reading in between the lines in a way, looking at the level of the word, the sentence phrases, because as you point to, there is this conundrum in our historical record where many who were enslaved do not have a neat historical record, a written record that we can use today. And so this brings me to the next point that I wanted to touch upon, and you brought up the issue of literacy. Because there were moments throughout the Craft journeys north from Georgia where literacy was crucial. Mm-hmm. There were crucial moments where literacy could have played a sort of life or death moment, if you will, And so, as someone who studies the history of African American education, I understand that deep connection between literacy and freedom. But I'm wondering, for our audience, can you share just a little bit about how literacy was important to understanding the Craft's journey towards freedom?
Mm-hmm. So much to tackle there, I think the first, most obvious thing to deal with is the fact that they needed, in order to have they didn't have mobility. They were denied mobility. They had more mobility than most because William Craft was a cabinet maker. He had some independence as a worker. He was able to work at a hotel and work after hours in this cabinetry shop. So he was able to move around a little bit more than most. Ellen Craft as well. She was also a skilled seamstress. She was beloved, considered the favorite enslaved servant by her biological half-sister, who was her mistress. So they have more mobility. And even yet, anytime they move, they're required to have a written pass. And if you cannot read and if you cannot write, you cannot produce those written passes. So those are written passes that are created by the people who employ them or by their enslavers, and it says, you know, they're allowed to be at a certain place for a certain amount of time for this purpose. And if they are caught without such a pass, you can actually read this in the statutes of Georgia, and it's really shocking to see. You can see these statutes, which I've referenced in my footnotes. You can pull that up on Hathi Trust. You can see all the rules, and you can see that there are high physical, brutal punishments for being caught without a pass. And if you are outside and you are moving, any white person, and you are a black person, any person can come and require that you show that, and they can question you, and they can, I think the phrasing is like moderately correct you. What constitutes moderation in that context, you know? I mean, anything can happen. So literacy becomes crucial. You have to have that written word as authorization in order to be able to move. And that's even before you get to, you know, the question of how do you know where you're going? You know, if you don't have a map, if you don't have a sense of where you are in space, all that enslavers purposely wanted to hide from enslaved people so that they wouldn't be able to escape, which is why, I mean, it's just extraordinary that the Crafts were able to pull off what they did.
That's certainly remarkable, given just the tenuous history we've had surrounding literacy, right? And many anti-literacy statutes that emerged. And I like how you bring up this example of passes, right? Because one could quite literally write their self to freedom, right? And on top of that, literacy also provided means for people to create intellectual objections to the institution of slavery. But there were moments in the writing, right, where Ellen, for example, stayed away from a hotel to avoid signing for something.
Yeah.
Right. And so there is this important connection between what they're doing, right, and her awareness of how literacy is a tool of freedom and how she negotiates that.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how you make sense of how she's negotiating all of these different logics surrounding literacy in her strategy.
Yeah.
If you could speak to her strategy and how she sort of avoided some of these moments that were tests to her literacy.
Well, I think, well, first of all, there's so many different kinds of literacy, I think, and Ellen is an expert at reading people, at reading bodies, at reading expressions, at reading clothes. I mean, those are all expert forms of knowledge that she has and she brings to this, even without being able to decode letters. So that, you know, literacy in terms of writing and reading on the page, that's one form of literacy, but there are others in which she was incredibly skilled. I would also say that disability becomes a key aspect of her disguise because it masks her inability to read and to write. So part of this disguise that she wears is she has her arm in a sling. She puts her right arm in a sling. So, you know, how can you write if your arm is injured, right? She asks William, who gathers the different parts of her costume for this performance of a lifetime, she asks him specifically to get a pair of glasses, and she gets green glasses. That's another form of sort of literacy that we can kind of enter as we look at the 19th century, apparently. And I have a friend who's like an expert dress historian who knows like she has like incredible style literacy from the 19th century. And she says, actually, if you had yellow glasses, that would signify that you might have syphilis. So that's not what they wanted to do. She gets the green glasses, which suggests that your eyes are strained from reading. So what an irony here, right? So it's like the disability that's indicating that she is reading so much that she has that her sight is impaired, when in fact it's masking the fact that she can't read at all.
And that's masterful.
Oh, yeah.
And really an insightful story and even provides a lesson for how we may navigate certain issues today, right? And in terms of strategy. And so to this next point, I think that is a fascinating vignette that you offer. But as someone who did the deep work of researching the story, the labor of writing the story into this narrative that you produced in your book, what story was most captivating for you? And what story must our audience today know?
Oh, that is really hard. I mean,
I figured it'd be.
the central narrative line being the crafts, that is obviously, I had to work really hard to just stay focused on that, because one of the things that I wanted to do was actually to bring in the stories of so many other people. And if you open the book, you can see, actually, this is one of my favorite parts of the book, but if you open it up, you'll see these images of all these different people who are in their world, who are in the world of the crafts and who inspire them either directly or indirectly. We think of the crafts as being these lonely heroes, which they were on this journey. There was just the two of them. But there was an army behind them in many ways too, and especially once they got to the north. So I think, it was hard enough just to stay focused on the craft story in the book, but there's so many other sort of secondary stories in this that run through, all these other, each of these people has their own story. I think I will just, because he's super handsome, he's right in the middle here, is Robert Purvis is one of everybody's favorite people, but he was known as one of the leaders of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. He's this really suave and charismatic South Carolinian, actually extremely wealthy man of color who hides the crafts once they come into Pennsylvania, and they actually thank him in the book. And he's got all kinds of adventures of his own. I could go on a whole Robert Purvis tangent here. But he's just one of them, right? And then there's William Wells Brown, who's this incredible orator, best-selling author. I would just every time I would see him, I would get so distracted that it was just really hard to kind of pull myself back to the story. But he's an incredible storyteller. He teaches the crafts how to tell their story. So when they're past Robert Purvis's house, we made it past Robert Purvis's house, they're hiding out with Quakers, and their plan is really originally to go to Canada, and that would have been the safest thing. But this incredible man comes dancing in, and he says, he is dazzling. He dazzles huge audiences, thousands of people are weeping and also laughing and reacting to the stories that he's telling about his own journey of self-emancipation, other people that he's known. He knows as soon as he hears about the crafts, something goes off, and he's these guys are going to be incredible for other people to see. They're attractive, they've got this incredible story, what drama, what life, and so he goes to them and he says, will you do this, for the cause, for all those people who are left behind in bondage? And this is an incredibly dangerous thing that he's asking them to do. But this is a risk that he himself knows, because he is still, by law, enslaved in Kentucky. So he is going on this incredible journey, and he is pulling the crafts along with them, and they could be captured at any time in the North, because it is within the legal rights of their enslavers to take them back, if they can catch them.
And it's exciting that you bring up William Wells Brown. I did not come across that name until I started working at the museum and was putting together an exhibit, because he was at the Jubilee celebrations following Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But as you highlight, there's other figures like William Cooper Nell, who's featured on your title, Charles Lennox Ramond, amongst others, right?
And the women, we can't forget.
And the women, we cannot forget the women. Harriet Hayden, amongst others, right? We cannot forget them. And so this next question may be a little selfish in nature, but I feel as though I must ask it as someone who works at the Museum of African American History. So as I was reading your text, I could not help but hone in on those references to the Meeting House, right? So the Meeting House, as we know, it was the home of the Massachusetts Colored General Association, which formed with William Lloyd Garrison to make the New England Anti-Slavery Society. And so it was really a hotbed of radical abolition. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to, right, this gathering site for freedom, right, and how it's important to understanding who in the community that the crafts entered when they made it to Boston.
Oh yeah, I mean that's why they go to Boston, right? Because it's supposed to be this really protective enclave, and at the very heart of this, at the nucleus of this, is the African Meeting House. It's known as like Black Faneuil Hall or Black Freedom's Hall, it's been called. And the incredible thing about it is you can go there today, and you go into the space, and it's this beautiful sort of rounded, light-filled, spiritual space, and we were talking about this before, you can feel the power of history when you walk in there, and you can just picture Douglas at the front, or Brown, or the Crafts, and other people telling their stories and having the crowd call back at them. I mean, history was made in this incredible hall, and I urge everybody to go visit. I mean, you can feel the power of that history and of the movement in that space, and their incredible interpretations of that history. It was also a historic schoolhouse. So speaking of education, we can circle back to that whole issue of literacy. It's a place where children were learning to read. It was a place where, politics, you have all these different political leaders coming together. I mean, plans made, like when the Fugitive Slave Act passes. I could go on and on about this incredible space that exists today.
Yeah, and to this point, because I see you touch upon the Fugitive Slave Act, and I just want to make sure everyone in the audience understands the deep impacts of that law.
Yeah.
Right? So how did the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act impact the livelihoods of not only the Crafts, but many in the North who had fled to freedom? Yeah,
and actually anyone, right? All Black people, or it could be argued like all Americans were affected by this incredible law. So there had been a Fugitive Slave Act in place. There already was. I mean, the Constitution itself made it possible, legally possible, for enslavers like those who enslaved the Crafts to reclaim their slaves. However, it was tricky when you have a place like Boston, when you have such a powerful community, and when you have like a place like Beacon Hill where, I mean, there are it's like a maze. There are these back alleyways. NBC 10 just did like a program with me where I actually walked through some of those places, and you can see, I mean, they're all in existence today. It's an incredible tour to do. But, there's a reason why people were not actually pursuing fugitives. Ellen Crafts enslaver decided that he was not going to act. He didn't until this law kicks into place, because this law, where to even begin with this law? I mean, it was really like the story of the Crafts intersects with the history of America in this like incredible moment. I mean, North and South, they're like on the verge of civil war. And it's really this Fugitive Slave Act which is at the, the crux of this. And with the passage of the act, there's a sense that, okay, maybe we can find a way to compromise. It's part of the compromise of 1850. But what this does is, as is commonly said, like it puts teeth into this law. So it empowers the enslavers as never before. It also so it makes it possible so that the Crafts enslavers can either go themselves, come to Boston, or have surrogates come in, and if they testify, if they make the case that these two people are their slaves, the Crafts have no ability to speak back in a court of law. So if you're accused and the judge or the commissioner, they're specially appointed commissioners who can actually give approval for this, you can be taken. Anybody can be taken. Not only that, but if we were living back in the 1850s and I were to say, all right, let's say I was a commissioner or I was a person of authority and I wanted to raise a posse to go hunt down William and Ellen Craft, you would have to come with me. If I called you and I said, you need to come as part of this group, you have to. So it turns like the nation potentially into slave hunters, no matter what side you're on. And there are I mean, I could just nerd out on like the details of that law, but those are some of the big pieces. And the bottom line is that everyone is terrified. Any black person really could be seized, could be kidnapped, and has no ability to fight back. And then what happens when you have somebody like Ellen Craft, who presents as white, right? That really confuses people. And in fact, there are arguments made. I was reading one newspaper article where somebody was saying, what if, your daughter, she has a spurned lover and your daughter is white, and the spurned lover wants to take your daughter, and he comes and makes the case that your daughter is an enslaved person, right? I mean, Ellen Craft, by breaking down those boundaries of like white and black, of who looks like an enslaved person, who is an enslaved person, who can be an enslaved person, she throws everything into chaos in a way that is very helpful for the abolitionist cause.
Yeah, and to this point about how she throws the order of things in chaos, right? Passing as a white man, right? Passing as someone who has or is enslaving someone, right? What does that reveal about our nation or our national story?
Yeah.
Right? Because I'm very interested in, right, because this story is, as much as it is about the crafts themselves, it intersects in many ways with our national story and also democratic revolutions that are taking place in Europe, right? And so how does this story and what they were able to do, what does that reveal about America or our world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it underscores the fact that we have always been what I recently heard Clint Smith talk about as being sort of a both and nation. We are both a nation of democracy and of freedom, all these incredible values, right? We have the Declaration of Independence, our founding document, and then we have the fact that coexisting with this is our enslavement of people from the various earliest days, even before the founding of our nation. We are both these things at once. And I mean, like David Walker, who wrote this appeal in the 1830s. He's a black activist, militant black activist, who writes this incredible appeal where he's calling up for uprising. But what he says about the Declaration of Independence is like, do you understand your own language? And that the same thing comes up, with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act and people gathering in the African meeting house, and they're calling on the Declaration of Independence. They're pointing out all these values. The Crafts also, in the beginning of their narrative, Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom, they quote the Declaration of Independence. They've heard readings of this in Macon. So they've heard these words. They've heard, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? That they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are real words, those are real American values, and the challenge is that it didn't apply to everyone. And I think it's that sort of, you can call it hypocrisy, you can call it both and, that the Crafts really bring to light.
And then to close with one final question before we transition to our audience Q&A, what is important for our audience? We are in a moment where we're seeing race and racism appear in new ways to meet our times. What lessons does this book offer for those who are in pursuit and seeking justice in our current day?
That is a beautiful question. I wonder if I might throw it back to you.
Yeah. Sure thing. And I can speak from my reading, but I think it speaks to the importance of being fugitive in certain ways and pursuits, whether it be sneaking to learn to read and write, whether it means sneaking to dress as a man, an enslaving man, right, in the 19th century, right? But I think there is a sort of a power in being fugitive in your means, right? Having this sort of forward presence of deference, right, but also working with an ulterior means of freedom. And I think through the story, we see just how through these fugitive means, right, playing to be someone that we're not, right, but actively knowing who we are at the same time and working towards justice, right, that offers lessons for today. And I think there is important scholarship, including yours, that is taking us up in the moment, that can encourage folks in a moment where there's sort of backlash against teaching certain histories, backlash against trans peoples, right? How can we be fugitive in our means? And I think the story offers us a sort of lesson, although it may not be a one-to-one for today, but it offers a lesson in the power of being fugitive in what we do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Embrace fugitivity.
Embrace fugitivity.
And where are we fleeing?
It's all close. All right. And so at this point, we can open it up to our audience who may have questions for our wonderful author today. So please.
Thank you. Eugene Kogan. I'm actually a diplomatic historian by training. I don't know if you identify as a historian with a PhD in English literature. I don't know if that's how you think of yourself. But I am curious about, in a time, sort of following up on the last question that was posed to you, in a time that's very ahistorical in many ways, where there's an ahistorical bent in society. What do you see as a role for a historian, or at least for a writer of history in society today?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for the distinction, because I do consider myself a writer of history, but not a historian. As you noted, my official training is in literature, although I did a lot of coursework in history, and I was always sort of obsessed with history. But my area is really narrative nonfiction or narrative history. I'm interested in the story, but I'm interested obviously in the history. I think the history is, just going back again to that space, to the space of Beacon Hill, and the fact that you can trace that with 19th century maps, the fact that you can see these same alleyways, the fact that so much of what is in existence then continues to exist physically now. I think it's analogous to the fact that, like, the foundations of everything that we are experiencing now in our present moment have these long roots, have these there's a shadow of the past that's continuing into the present. And my goal, my personal goal, is to make this world and the roots of what we're dealing with now feel so present and so palpable that we can see those connections as a means to begin some kind of a healing. Because when you go to the doctor, the doctor doesn't just start with what's ailing you right this moment. They want to know how you got your injury, where are you coming from? History is always important. And so to bring that past into present, I think is critical for being able to move forward. It's how we overcome our national trauma.
Any questions?
Well, I just finished the book. I found it riveting. I loved it, and it stayed with me. So, how do you move on? Once you're so immersed with these characters, is it difficult for you to let go of them?
I think I still haven't moved on, to be honest. And it's something, the story has continued to have a journey for me personally, even beyond the writing of the book. So I was definitely obsessed with the details and the people, and I was talking to them, and my family at times thought I was crazy, But just to give some examples, near the African American, the African American History Museum or the African Meeting House, the home of Louis Hayden, with the underground secret tunnels and everything, that's there. And I was walking by, with a film crew just to sort of show them where it was. And like serendipitously, like the door opened to me. And actually this was captured in this NBC 10 program that I alluded to before. But so like being in that space and encountering like those histories in the present, that's been like another way to connect to the story. Also the crafts have incredible descendants, you know? I mean, they fled bondage in order to be able to have this family and freedom. And their children, you know, they had 7 children. I wrote 6 in the book, but I learned later that there was another child who died in England. The 5 surviving children, a number of them had children, and they had children. I've met now the great-great and great-great-great-great grandchildren of William and Ellen Craft, and they're extraordinary people, so that there's continuity. And that goes back to the previous question too, is like, you know, the meaning of that past in the present, that their past lives on in the present, like literally.
So I'm interested in the craft of your story, pun intended. You did so much research and you must have been so immersed in their world. How did you turn off your research brain and turn on your writing brain? What was that process like? How did you assemble? It's just so deep and so rich, your material. How did you actually write the book?
Thank you. I'll have to say that it was painful, and it came in many phases. And I've talked about this elsewhere before, but I had like one huge, horrible draft. And it was so bad that my editor was like, you just have to start over, because it was all research and no story, and I had to lead with a story. So that was a continual challenge for me, is to figure out how to lead with a story, especially like when people like William Wells Brown or Robert Purvis or Harriet Hayden, all these people are like, come with me, and I'd be like, okay, you know. And then, you know, so I think one of the things that really helped me in this is to sort of have it unfold like cinematically in my mind. So I thought, all right, a camera has to move like in time. You can only do one thing at a time. So if I'm seeing this story unfold, what am I seeing? What am I imagining? And especially as I'm relying on all these different camera people, whether it's William Wells Brown or like disgruntled British travelers who are just describing the stench of the, you know, what the train feels like. I'm cutting in all their different points of view as I'm sort of pulling into the craft story. So that was something that really helped. Then there was the painful like editing process. Like this book was just like hundreds of pages long. And I recently heard a story of like my first editor, Don Davis, who did like the heavy just like amputation. A friend of hers was saying that like she edits, you know, on the beach. And so one day she was sitting next to her friend, my editor, Don Davis, who's on the beach, and she's seeing her making this like going like this with her arm. She's like, what is she doing? And she sees that she is crossing out entire like whole pages. I got like entire pages back. So I actually think that was Alice Walker that she did that too. So that made me feel a little bit better. But so having other people sort of steer you in, having readers like Kim Ragusa, who wrote The Skin Between Us, which is just another incredible book that I highly recommend. You know, having other people help rein you in, that's definitely essential.
Other questions from the audience?
What are you doing next?
That's a great question. You know, I'm still really immersed in this particular story. Since we have a couple 11-year-olds in the audience, and I've been thinking about this a lot, like especially because that was such a critical age for both crafts, especially for Ellen. I've been thinking about how to make this story, other stories like this, accessible, available, compulsively readable to younger readers.
I get that from my granddaughter who's 10 when she's ready for it. I'm going to do before I leave here because I was so impressed with the detail of the clothes. You know, the picture of time in a way that I hadn't ever seen it before or thought about it before. Every detail that you put in there. I know they cut lots of them out, but the ones that they left behind surely drew a picture. And then I was thinking about the timeline. So there was a history before the 1800s, and there's going to be a history of the 2100s, and how it's not linear, but it's just something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost in some ways like the histories feel kind of simultaneous, and especially when you look at the past against the present. And thank you for noticing the details. I mean, it was like really, I got into the sensory details. Again, like going back to the crafts narrative, I wanted to do something that magnified their story. So whether that means like bringing out like storylines, things that we don't know, like why did they escape? Why did they have to escape so suddenly, so fast? That's not something that they describe. So there are those bigger questions. But there are other things like, when they're on a steamboat and I mentioned that Ellen's wearing glasses, but she's also wearing these poultices on her face. I was like, what is a poultice? And when William, they grow suspicious because William goes into the gentleman, like she basically dives into her cabin, and she just is not going to come out. But then the people in this steamboat are like, that's a little weird. Like, why isn't she coming out and hanging with us? And so Ellen has William, she's the one who suggests that he goes and warms up these medicinal poultices. And they smell so badly that the guys are like, we're just gonna chuck those out the window, or not the window, overboard or something like that. And I was like, what did they smell like, And apparently, there is a 19th century book, like a recipe book, that will tell you how to make so I actually have it in the footnotes. If you want to make yourself a stinky poultice, you can figure out how to make a stinky poultice. So all those kind of details to try to bring the smells and the tastes and the textures of the times. That was really exciting to me. So if it helped enliven your experience, that was
I have a question about the crafts. How did they go from being illiterate to writing the narratives that you described that you created?
I mean, determined study. It's one of the reasons why, when Ellen Craft is asked when she's in Boston, and we haven't even talked about this, but so much of this unfolds right near here, and there's a celebrity author who's sort of interviewing them, and she says, if you say it wasn't that bad, that they didn't beat you or that you didn't have these those kinds of experiences, then why would you run away? And I'm sure I can't even imagine how she would begin to try to answer this. But what she says is, she said, they might not have done those kinds of things. They might have been spared those kinds of punishments. That's something they write in their narrative. But they didn't give me my rights as a human being, is what she said. They wouldn't let me learn. And so the desire for literacy, which is something that's so prized within her enslavers' households, there's so many levels of irony. And one thing that I talk about is the fact that, her father and her biological half-sister, mistress's husband, they both helped bring in education for women in Macon. And meanwhile, Ellen, is not even allowed to read. So as soon as she gets the opportunity, she's determined. And what's amazing is that you can see this letter that she wrote months after they finally arrive at a place where they can study in England. And she's got this incredible penmanship. So she's clearly an artist, so she's picking up so she can pick up those the fine manual, the dexterity skills. But they've also been learning how to tell their story and how to perform. They've been doing this all their lives. So that comes out naturally. So it's once they learn how to write it down, there's no stopping them.
I have a question. So, how did you research this? Because, you were saying a lot of it, there's obviously some literature, but, what were your sources? Are they academia? Are they museums? And how long did the research take to put all this narrative together?
Yeah, it took years. It started off I think a good place to start is with the academic sources to see what people have dug up before. But then I went down to all different kinds of rabbit holes, and I looked at newspapers, I looked at letters, I looked at tons of deeds. I traveled everywhere too. So I went down south to Georgia. That's really when things started opening up, when I hit the archives and was able to find these just documents that nobody had seen that detailed, for example, the process of Ellen Craft being deeded or William Craft being mortgaged. So I went to Georgia, and then I sort of went all the way along the route, and then also to England. And each one of those places you can learn a lot archivally, but also just being in that space. So it was a combination of materials, you know, archival records and legal records and letters and newspapers and books, experience, oral histories. I mean, like everything. I sort of tried to deep dive into everything that possibly could shed light.
Private collections, or?
Well, luckily, like a lot of the crafts materials, their descendants donated them to the Avery Research Center, so that was one early spot. But a lot of these things, like the deeds, you can get them in courthouses. You can also get them online. A lot of the private papers are now publicly available. You just have to know where to find them. And I do tell you where you can find them in the book.
All right, and so at this point we can transition from Q&A, and I would like to invite our author to read a passage from the book, just to give the audience, for those who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, just to get a sense of what's within its pages.
Okay. All right, you know, maybe I'll just read the first two paragraphs because this kind of gets it. This is actually not the flavor of the book because the action of the story really happens after the overture, but I begin with this overture to sort of give you a feeling of the scope. It's like in an orchestra, if you go to a Broadway show or if you go to an opera or something, the overture will sort of sing out the notes, the tunes that you're going to hear. So that's what I try to do here. There was some argument, I have to say, at the last minute between editors, whether we start like in The Cottage, which is much more dynamic, like where the crafts are just like hiding, it's 4 a.m., or we start with the overture. I fought for the overture. You can tell me whether you think that we made the right choice. So, Revolutions of 1848. In 1848, William and Ellen Craft, an enslaved couple in Georgia, embarked upon a 5,000-mile journey of mutual self-emancipation across the world. Theirs is a love story that begins in a time of revolution, a revolution unfinished in the American War for Independence, a revolution that endures. This story opens in that year of global democratic revolt, when, in wave upon wave, Sicily, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and all across Europe, the people rose up against tyranny, monarchy, the powers that be. News of these uprisings ricocheted, carried across the seas by high-speed clipper ships, overland by rail, and in defiance of time and space by the marvelous electromagnetic telegraph. From New York down to New Orleans, Americans raised torches in celebration, sure that these revolutions rhymed with their own.